Okay, so today we're going to look at the types of evil that are typically used in problems of evil. There are two types, natural evil and moral evil. I've written it the other way around, moral evil and natural evil. Let's start with the the definitions of the two terms. So, moral evil is the kind of evil that is perpetrated or performed by humans. So it's performed by free moral agents. Let's understand what we mean by those terms. So, in this case of the bank robber could have done otherwise, which means that the bank robber was free. The bank robber was a moral agent in that their actions are morally judgeable. We might compare this, for instance, to say some killer ants, some very ferocious kind of South American ants that will consume everything in their path. You may have seen them in documentaries. They live in jungles and they spread out from their nest and they consume everything. Other animals, even small mammals, supposedly even babies. Those aren't moral agents. They haven't performed a morally bad thing because they are not judged by morality. They don't do good or bad in that sense. Rather, they act according to their instincts. Whereas a moral agent is a person. A person is capable of doing otherwise and is therefore morally responsible. So it's negative acts performed by free moral agents. On the other side of the coin, we have natural evil. This is stuff like volcanoes. Boom. Sometimes, instead of calling it evil, we might call it suffering or pain. In his book on the problem of evil, C.S. Lewis, the author of the Narnia books, but also a popular theologian, called the book The Problem of Pain for this reason. That actually it's not necessarily evil because it's not performed by a moral agent. Rather, natural evil or natural suffering is the result. Oh, that's not how you spell result, Luke. You know it's one of my videos because I misspelled a word. The result of natural circumstances. Or essentially, the working of the world. So, volcanoes erupt on a regular basis because of the way that the Earth is formed, because of plate tectonics and so on. There's no choice involved there, but the suffering is real. The houses covered are real. If you've ever been to Pompeii, you've seen the terrified look of the corpses encased in ash. So the question really then becomes about the origin of these kinds of things. So on the one side, it's pretty obvious. For moral evil, it's obvious. The origin of moral evil is twofold. Free will, so that is the ability to have done otherwise, so choice, and knowledge of good and evil. So knowledge of good and evil gives us the ability to choose between those two things. I've put a tree here with fruit for a reason. We'll talk about that in a second. On the other side of the coin, we have natural evil. Now, as we're going to see as we go through, natural evil is definitely a bigger problem for those who are religious. Let's unpack why that would be the case. So natural evil is the result of kind of the natural workings of the world. When we first saw those pictures, when you first seen a picture of the Earth from space, you may have seen that really famous that really famous picture. Um, if you haven't, go and check it out. It's called Moonrise, um, and it's taken from the surface of the moon as the Earth comes up as if it is in sunrise. And in that picture, you see this wonderfully peaceful planet. But we know that peaceful planet disguises all kinds of levels of suffering and pain. When Darwin actually published on the origin of species, the the reaction from the Christian authorities, from the church and so on, was very negative, but not for the reason that you might think. If you've looked at the design argument, you might think, well, it really undermines the design hypothesis. But things had already done that. People knew that the world was much older than claimed. No, the thing that was controversial about Darwin's book was that he noted that the Earth and the life in it wasn't kind of all things bright and beautiful, everything harmonious, getting on together. Instead, it was a brutal and bloody fight for survival. That peaceful planet contains much, much suffering. But all of that evolution, volcanoes and so on, is the result, ultimately, of the laws of physics. The laws of physics are set up in a particular way that it will result in these sorts of circumstances. Now, if you're religious, if you're an atheist, you stop there, right? You say, well, the laws of physics, the universe exists and runs on certain regularities, and it just is the way that it is. But if you're religious, you think that the laws of physics are put down by God. And therefore, the ultimate responsibility for all of the suffering in the world is God's. So this really turns us onto our kind of application stage now. How are they relevant and important to our understanding of the problem of evil? Well, let's start with moral evil, because it's a little bit harder to understand. You'd think, well, if we perform morally bad actions, then we're the ones to blame. Of course, in the Bible, that's not the case, right? In Genesis 3, so Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve eat the fruit of knowledge. And gain knowledge of good and evil. Remember, that is one of the key things here that produces moral evil. And this is put here by God. God allows this to happen. In fact, if God is omniscient, then he was going to know that was going to happen. So you could argue that God is responsible for moral evil. In terms of natural evil, it's, frankly, significantly simpler. God, according to the religious, so according to theists, that is, people who believe in the traditional kind of Judaic, Christian, Islamic God, God created the universe. So he created the laws of physics. And so, of course, is responsible for the suffering. One popular response to this few hundred years ago came from Leibniz, um, who argued that God is perfect and so must have created the greatest possible world. The response to this came from Voltaire, who wrote a book called Candide, in which the central character goes from one absolute disaster to another, from like a horrific earthquake to other sorts of terrible suffering. And every time he comes out of that, he goes, "Ah, this is the greatest possible world." Is it? Let's just look. I just want to quickly examine one other kind of response. Obviously, we're going to spend quite a few tutorials looking at responses, but I want to look at one more response because it really informs us about our understanding of these types of evil. So, a relatively standard response comes from the free will defense. The free will defense says that free will is important. Like, it's really important. Without it, we wouldn't be the kind of people that we are. Remember, moral evil is performed by moral agents, persons. If you don't want to be like the ants we talked about at the beginning of the tutorial, then ultimately you've got to allow for moral evil to occur. So that's how we get to moral evil. But we also, in order to get to moral evil, we also need knowledge of good and evil. Otherwise, our free will isn't really free. And so, in order to get to kind of knowledge of good and evil, we need to already experience evil. And given that moral evil is ruled out, that must be natural evil. So natural evil is actually there, according to a relatively standard free will defense. It's there to give us the chance to perform free actions. So we might then reform our understanding of natural evil from something that helps us to perform actions to something a bit more like this. William L. Rowe talks about the type of evil he's interested in using in a problem of evil as unnecessary suffering. So unnecessary suffering is that which persons can't learn from and isn't beneficial to persons at all. An example of this, I'm just going to write down the name and I'll tell you about it. An example of this would be a fawn that dies in a forest fire. And in that forest fire, there's pain and suffering, but ultimately there's no record of the fawn dying. It just ends and is completely burned up. So no one can learn anything from it. It just stops being in agony. And that, thinks Rowe, is a kind of unnecessary suffering that is the natural consequence of the world, but a good God would have stopped, but hasn't. So when you think about natural evil, you might use Rowe's definition of unnecessary suffering, which is the result of circumstances.